Hello and thank you so much for joining me here on the WOW YouTube channel. My name is Sasha Reade and today I've got a really awesome project for you and I cannot wait to share it. So today we are going to be making a marbled effect. So I am following nonstop DIYers all over YouTube and like Facebook Reels, and I have become really obsessed with watching people make these DIY resin worktops. And I thought maybe we could do this in card making. And that's what we're going to do today, and the effect is amazing, and I cannot wait to share it with you because it's really quite simple and easy. Now for my marble effect, I wanted to make sure that I was using sort of like a panel or a shape rather than the whole entire front of a card, because we are going to use quite a bit of embossing powder and I want to make my embossing powder last as long as possible. Now embossing powder does stretch a lot and you can do so much for so long with it, but we are going to do several layers, and so therefore I want to have it be more like a panel rather than the whole entire front of my card. So I've made these little panels here, and they are 7 by 10.5 centimeters. So just a little panel to kind of pop right in the middle of my card front. Now I've cut 4 of them. I want a nice thick chunky layer, and the reason we're doing that is because we are doing a lot of heating and a lot of embossing powder, and I want like a really solid chunk. So if you've got sort of chipboard shapes or maybe even like wooden embellishment shapes, that would work really well as well. I am just stacking 4 really thick pieces of cardstock, so I've got a really nice thick embellishment to go on my card. Now the easiest way I found to do this was to attach like a handle to the back of it. And I tried several different tapes and they all kind of just fell off. So I am using red line tape. This is like super glue in tape form, and I'll share with you how I get it off at the end. It's really simple and easy and you don't end up needing to rip your cardstock off. But you have got 4 layers, so you have got room to work with. Now I've got a handle so I can hold this for when I put my embossing powder on and when I do my heat embossing, and I don't have to worry about trying to work out how I'm going to hold it because we're going to cover that whole panel in embossing powder. Now I'm using white embossing powder. You want an opaque embossing powder. You want one that is not translucent, that is quite nice and thick and dark. Dark? Light. But you know, opaque, so it's not translucent, it's not see-through. And I'm using white because that's what a lot of people do for these kitchen worktops. They do white and then they kind of add in their sort of marble effect with some gray paint or silver or gold. So I'm going to take my WOW heat tool and I'm going to pop it onto number 2. I'm going to heat it up and then I'm going to melt my embossing powder. So I've done 1 layer across this whole little panel and now I'm heating it to melt it up. Now I'm going to hold it up to the camera and you can see it's quite bubbly. You can see it's a little bit speckly. And that's why we're going to do some layers. We want a really nice thick layer of embossing powder. We need lots of white embossing powder on there. Now, if you're quick, you could dip it back into your embossing powder and then heat it again. But because I'm not quick and I don't have an easy way of dipping this into some embossing powder, given I've got this big stick on the back, I am waiting for it to cool. Then I'm going to ink it up again with my ink pad, my sticky ink, for embossing, and then I'm going to sprinkle on my embossing powder. And I do this 4 times. So I wait for it to cool in between each time, and then I add on my ink and I add on my embossing powder. And then that way we're getting a really nice thick layer. And this only took a couple minutes. It's not going to take you forever. And it doesn't use up all your embossing powder, so don't panic. If you are worried, then just do a smaller panel. You'll see I've got a heart coming up in a minute and you can see what it looks like. So that's after layer 3. It's still a little bit bumpy. You want to add enough layers that it's totally smooth looking and really kind of glossy and looks dimensional. So here's my embossing powder. I have used this loads already on other projects, but you can see I'm not even a quarter of the way down the jar, and I've just added 4 layers onto this panel, and I already did the heart before I shared this bit for you. So I'm going to wait for this to be super cool. It needs to be completely cold before you do the next step, so do not do this when it's warm. I'm going to bring in an embossing powder bag. Now, normally with embossing powders from WOW, you do not need one of these. It's kind of built into their embossing powder. But we are adding embossing powder on top of embossing powder that's melted. So it is slightly tacky and slightly sticky. So you do need to have that little embossing buddy to kind of add on to the top and make it not less sticky. If you haven't got one, you could use cornstarch or corn flour, that will also work, or baby powder, that will also work, and just kind of apply some on there so it's not sticky. Now I'm taking this really awesome little applicator brush thing from WOW, and I'm going to add on some random doodly lines that kind of look a bit like a marble effect. So just randomly plop those lines down. Now this is thick, and this is the key to using that little brush thing, is it's really, really thick. So it gives you a really good surface area for this embossing powder to stick to. I'm now taking my gold super fine embossing powder, and you can see because I use the embossing powder bag, I'm not getting much at all stuck on there. Now this is important. Start with number 1 on your heat tool, the lower air part of your heat gun. So 1 is less air, same amount of heat. Number 2 is more air, same amount of heat. So use less air because I've put like a really thick layer of that embossing ink on there and then the embossing powder. I didn't want any of that powder to blow off. I want a really nice thick dose of that powder. Now I'm going to crank it up to number 2 and I'm going to blow. And I'm going to use the air from my gun and the heat, and you can start to see the magic happen. We're melting the 2 powders together and we're shifting them around, and you just play with this as long as you want and get the effect that you want and kind of merge those lines, blend them in with the white. It is so amazing. So you just kind of play around for a little bit, move your lines about, make that embossing powder kind of disappear, reappear. The gold kind of melts into the white a little bit, and then you can pop it back out and kind of have it a little bit disguised. But look how gorgeous is that? It looks just like a marble effect countertop. So I love it. I love this really fun, unique way of playing with embossing powders, melting them and moving them. Now here's my heart. So this is obviously on a smaller scale. I did the exact same thing. I glued my chopstick to the back and did the exact same steps. I did 4 layers of white and then that gold on top. Now you could switch this up. You could do colors as well. You could do like pinks or blues. As long as it is opaque and not translucent, you will be able to do this effect with that as well. So here's how I'm getting rid of that stick. I'm just slicing through the red tape and then I'm pulling off my chopstick. I'm going to leave the red tape on there because I'll just use that as adhesive. Now my embossing folder today is from Lisa Horton Crafts, and it is a gorgeous quilt embossing folder, so it gives you this really beautiful design. And I'm going to cut myself a matte layer to go behind my front panel that we just created. So it's just a little bit smaller than my card base. I'm going to line that up in my embossing folder, run it through my Big Shot, and then we've got this gorgeous bit of texture to go on our card. I kept it the same color as the card base so it doesn't take away from that top panel. Now I put the panel on top and went, oh, this doesn't look very nice. And I thought, actually my white embossing powder is a little bit off-white, and actually my vanilla cardstock would probably look a lot better. So I switch it up here, do the exact same thing, but grab vanilla instead of white. And I love how that looks a lot more than the bright white underneath that panel. Now we can start assembling our card and putting it together. Because we've got that gorgeous panel, we don't need to do a heck of a lot more. So I'm going to apply some glue onto the back of my embossing folder bit, my embossing panel, embossed panel, and I'm going to stick that down. Now I'm going to take off the red line backing tape and I'm going to add some more red line tape just because my embossing folder is quite bumpy and I want to make sure this sticks really well, and I've already got some of that red line tape on there, so I might as well just keep going with it. To get the little strips off, I always use a pokey tool because it's really difficult to lift them up and they're quite staticky. So I can go ahead and place my panel on there, and then we can move on to adding our sentiment on and finishing off our card. I'm going to use my Trinity Stamps Happy and Birthday die sets. They are wonderful because they have an outline as well as the actual words, so then you can kind of layer them up and jazz them up a bit. So I'm going to take a piece of scrap cards and I'm going to add on some more embossing ink. I'm going to kind of dab it on because I find if I swipe, my ink pad starts to fall apart on me. So I'm going to dab that on the front, get a really nice layer of embossing ink, and then just chuck more of that gold on the top. That way our card is totally matchy-matchy and looks really nice when we're all finished because we've used the same gold as what we've done for our marble effect. Now I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to add a second layer on because when you have that, just that first layer, it's a little bit bumpety. And this just gives it a really nice smooth finish, so it looks really nice and solid and you can't really tell that it's embossing powder that we used. So I'm going to let that cool completely before I go ahead and put my dies on there, and I'm going to cut my words out of it and my outline out of the same vanilla that I used for my card base, so then again it's all matching and coordinating really nicely. Now if you struggle to get your dies out of your die cut, if you struggle to get your die cuts out of your die, and they're really sticking because of the embossing powder, what you can do is you can use your embossing powder bag before you put your die on top of your embossed piece of card. So dab your embossing buddy onto that die cut and get the die cut kind of covered in that sort of sticky, non-sticky layer, that powdery layer. Then when you go ahead and run it through your die cut machine, it should just pop out nice and easy. I didn't do that this time, so I did struggle a little bit, but that is a top way to get it out. Now to finish off my card front, I'm going to use some flat back golden sort of plasticky gems. They look like they're metallic though, and they are very similar to the gold that I've used in my card. So I'm just going to add a few of those dotted around using my homemade DIY picking me up tool, which is just a chopstick with blue tack on the end. And that finishes off this card. Now I did the exact same for the other one. I used a couple sets of heart dies, one from scrapbook.com, one from Craftelier, just because I wanted a nice big heart for the outside, and then my scrapbook.com ones only go so big. Again, I used that same embossing folder, and this time I combined my stamps with my dies from Trinity Stamps and created my sentiment on the front of my card. So all the same steps, but I used a smaller little front panel. I used a little heart instead, and then I backed it with the bigger heart and used my embossing folder for that. And I popped up the happy and the birthday off the front of the card again and added those little gems. So I hope you had fun with me today, and I hope you give this a go. It's really simple and easy to do, and it's such a stunning, gorgeous effect. And it really does look like a sort of marble countertop. So everything I used is in the description box down below, as well as links. Make sure you check out those links and click to like, follow, and subscribe. Take care and have a fantastic week ahead.